The Federal and Devaki Specialty Hospital jointly present the Madurai Marathon 2024 Run for Health on Sunday, October 20th, 2024. Entry is free for all.
Hello and welcome to the Federal. You're watching Off the Beaten Track, a program in which we take a complete holistic look at an issue. We are actually going to be traversing 360 degrees, what we have been doing for the last 2 years and more. But this is actually physically, in reality, we are going to be going through the entire 360 degrees sitting where the two of us are both sitting, I in Delhi and Mr. Katju in Hyderabad, where he is visiting family. It is often said that peace growth depends on good relations with neighbors. Unfortunately, in India, whichever direction one looks at, we find that we have some problem or the other with our neighbors. The situation is completely different, dramatically different from what it had appeared in 2014 when Mr. Modi took oath as the Prime Minister for the first time and invited the leaders of the South Asian countries. From that situation, we have a state where the SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, is virtually defunct. We also have fairly not so friendly neighbors at the moment. So let us look at each of these problems, go around, as I said, from one side to the other side. To help me do this and take a look at it, I am joined today by Mr. Vivek Katju, who is a very seasoned and retired diplomat who had spent several decades in the Indian Foreign Service before retiring. Somebody who has been in news because the role that he performed during the 1999 IC-814 hijack has been performed on a series which has been there on an OTT platform. Somebody actually acting the role of Mr. Katju, what he did, actually going up to Kandahar and negotiating with the hijackers and their other people. Mr. Katju has been an ambassador, Indian ambassador in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Thailand, so he understands the neighborhood very well. Welcome to the program, Mr. Katju. It's a real delight to have you. I have been speaking to you for long and been actually waiting for the right subject to crop up, and it so happened that just after the Sri Lanka presidential elections came out, the results came out, I felt that this was the right news peg, as we journalists say, to discuss the estrangement in the neighborhood. I'd like to hear from you. Right about Sri Lanka. What does this verdict mean, both in terms of security for India and in terms of bilateral relations?
Uh, Before we go to Sri Lanka and we go round 360 degrees, as you said, Nilanjan, permit me to make 2 points.
Yes.
The first is that difficulties between neighboring countries is not unusual. After
Okay.
all, uh, interests conflict more with your neighbors. That's part of our daily lives too as human beings, than with someone very distant. So that is a fact of life that uh, everyone in the international community understands. The second is that we have a peculiar problem that India is so very large in comparison with all its neighboring countries, including Pakistan, which,
Okay.
if you look at in objective terms, is a huge country. But India looms over Pakistan too. So there is a complexity that comes in because of this geography, which is which has its own peculiar characteristics, and these have been demonstrated through the decades.
Okay.
It requires great skill in managing neighboring relationships, uh, therefore, because on the one hand, there are sensitivities, that is, with our neighboring countries, there are sensitivities that India is acting like a big brother.
Okay.
And if it is acting like a big brother, like many countries say, I think I've even heard the Pakistanis say that you are like a big brother, then you should have show the generosity which a big brother is needs to
Supposed
show.
to display.
Yes, but countries don't act like that. I
True.
think even if we take this analogy of the big brother a little further, then I think the least the big brother can expect is that the other siblings will not start poking him, will not endanger his security, for instance. And I know it's not fashionable to go back into history now, but I remember that one of our wisest prime ministers in foreign policy was Inder Kumar Gujral. He
That's right.
didn't have much political clout or power, as we know, but he was a thinking man. And I think he had propounded this particular what became known as the Gujral doctrine that with the neighbors, he said that, look, we'll go the extra mile. We'll look after your economic interests. We'll try to integrate your economic interests with ours. But what we expect in return is that you'll not endanger our security. And
Right.
I think that was a very valid way of putting this relationship. Now, this applies equally to Sri Lanka and its present situation.
Right.
There's one fact also that let me mention. In the past, if you go back decades, I think there was an attempt on our part to draw a kind of a cordon sanitaire in South Asia that this is our thing, and we were very concerned with the Americans made an ingress or tried to make an ingress into Sri
Right.
Lanka. I remember at one stage there was worry that they were putting in listening stations, etc. Now it's China. China looms very large in South Asia, both to our west, to our south, and I dare say to our north and the east, and it's a reality that we have to deal with. So, having made these general points, let me come
Right.
to Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka.
Uh, my own impression is that uh, once a person assumes office, whatever may be his ideological background and propensities, the office itself imposes certain constraints.
Right.
The person, after assuming office, is briefed and he becomes aware of the full spectrum of possibilities, but more than that, of difficulties. So I would imagine that the new president in Sri Lanka and the new government which will come in, which will be aware that even if they want to balance the Indian relationship with, say, relations with other powers, and India is a power in South Asia, they will have to take into concern Indian interests, which doesn't
Okay.
mean that India should intervene and or interfere in domestic processes with of other countries. I, for one, am a great believer that we should never try to intervene in even a neighbor's internal processes. What we should,
Mhm.
as a general rule, follow is to draw a red line to say that look, you can do what you like within your own country, as long as that does not impact my interests. If you
Right.
start a, taking up a policy that leads to a mass exodus from your country to, to India, then naturally
Mm.
that would impact my interests, and I will have to take
True.
countermeasures to protect my interests. There's
This is
nothing
what
I can.
happened to Sri Lanka in the 1980s.
That is precisely the point, that if you start with similar nationalism in a very aggressive way, and it
Right.
leads to Tamil migration, Sri Lankan Tamil migration, Jaffna Tamil migration, and that will bring about a certain response and a certain reaction in Tamil Nadu because there are age-old affinities, there are cultural affinities, ethnic affinities in Tamil Nadu with a section of the Sri Lankan population with Tamils there. So then that becomes a difficulty, an irritant in the relationship, which is best avoided. I think in Sri Lanka, at a time of the economic crisis 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, we did go out of our way to stabilize, try
Right.
to stabilize the situation as we could. Now, gratitude is not a quality that is shown
Right.
in international ties. I, for one, and we've discussed this, you and I, numerous times,
Yes.
there's nothing called friendship in international
True.
relations. That's a term that,
It's,
as a
it's all a
diplomat,
need-based relationship.
absolutely, these are transactional things. I mean, uh, and we talk of, I have written drafts for political leaders to speak. I myself, as an envoy, have spoken of deep cultural connects and affinities and friendships, etc., knowing full well that these are good words, but at the end of the day, it's interests that have to coincide. So, with Sri Lanka, I'm reasonably certain that while the new government would seek to gain advantage from any source to help the Sri Lankan economy stabilize and grow, it
Right.
will be conscious of the need for maintaining a balanced relationship with India. And I think on our part, we should also tell them that look, your processes are your own. We have no favorites, and we should have no favorites. And our red lines are these, enunciate them
Yes.
fairly clearly, and then adhere to them.
True. Uh, there's also the issue that there is a certain amount of economic interdependence between India and Sri Lanka, which is also going to play an important role in what you said was stabilizing the relationship. Let's move on from Sri Lanka to, in an anti-clockwise manner, to Bangladesh, where it is being said by a large number of commentators, including, I think you also mentioned at some point that India possibly put, to use my words, all the eggs in one basket. That is the basket of the ousted political leader, that is Sheikh Hasina. The resignation and the departure of Sheikh Hasina, her still officially continuing to staying in India, and a new regime taking place, India taking a very important and a proactive role in the situation and the safety and security of minority Hindus in Bangladesh. Where exactly are we standing in terms of our relations with Bangladesh? Because from what I understand, that at least in the last decade or maybe slightly more, Bangladesh has possibly been India's best friend in the neighborhood.
Again, you've talked of the word friend. Now, to me, it seems that any objective analysis of a relationship between India and Bangladesh
Mhm.
uh, points in the direction that it is in the interest of both countries to have intense economic ties uh, and a political understanding with the point that I made initially that we have no favorites and we won't have any kind of say horse in the Bangladesh political race. But there is a history to Bangladesh India ties going back to the 70s.
That's right.
Uh, I think part of it was complicated because initially Bangladesh was East Pakistan and there was this baggage which came.
True.
Uh, Partly it was because there were forces in Bangladesh which assumed that India would interfere and that India uh, interference has to be combated. Partly it was ideological. You had a secular uh, constitution and you had a desire to be secular. On the other hand, there were forces within Bangladesh who wanted to be Islamic. Now, this created its own complexities and led to a situation where certain forces within Bangladesh, parties within Bangladesh, thought that they had a greater affinity in terms of their interests with India, whereas others looked elsewhere. And at a time when there were people in power in Bangladesh who looked elsewhere, there was also the feeling in India that they were allowing Bangladesh to be used as a base uh, for anti-Indian activity. Uh,
Okay.
and naturally, this is something that has to be countered and is countered by any country.
All right.
My last point is this, that, and this is often, I've reflected on this. There was a fun, in 1947, a fundamental difference occurred between India, as the partition took place,
Mhm.
between the movement and the transfer of populations in the north, in the northwest of India, say along with the west, what was then West Pakistan, and in the east. Whereas the transfer of populations, and it was a very bloody and terrible affair, was almost complete in the west, I think in the east did not take place.
Yes. It continued
And
for decades.
it continued for decades, and I think one of the concerns India had was that there shouldn't arise a situation where there's a sudden exodus of people from Bangladesh, what is now Bangladesh, and
Mm.
into India, which would make the management of the Indian social situation difficult.
Difficult.
And this was not an unnatural concern. There was also the feeling that we had to stabilize the states, what are now the states in the northeast, and there were insurgent groups, and that the management of these states shouldn't become difficult.
Very true.
So I think now the situation should be, and this is it's easier to say what should be than what actually how it plays out on the ground.
How
But
it is to be done.
the situation should be one. As far as Sheikh Hasina is concerned, she has had an affinity with India. She's lived in India in the past, and that if she wishes to stay on in India, I, for one, would never advocate that we show her the door. But we should make it clear to her and to the government in Dhaka that look, she will not be permitted to undertake any activities which will complicate our bilateral ties.
Sure. In
That is,
fact, she
I
had
think.
issued a statement right after her arrival here, and Dhaka did object to it fairly vehemently.
So I think in course of time, these are initial eruptions which take place when regimes change. But in course of time, this should be. Second, that again, as I said, are red lines. We tell them that look, there are geography demands that there has to be cooperation between Bangladesh and India, and that we have always wished to move in that direction, and that you should not have inhibitions that you are enveloped by India, that you are in India's embrace. We don't want to interfere with you. You're doing well, very well economically. I know you. We all know that you have difficulties now, but uh, what was once considered a basket case is no longer a basket case. Bangladesh has done well in certain sectors. And that if they wish to engage with other countries, we say that yes, please go right ahead and engage. But the red line is just this: don't adopt policies in any sector which will complicate your relations with us because it will impinge on our domestic security.
Right.
Should that take place, then naturally we'll have to protect our interests. Now, I don't want to speculate as to how we
Yes,
protect our
definitely.
interests,
It would be
but clearly,
incorrect.
if there is this understanding reached between Delhi and Dhaka, I, for one, would be happy. And let me add at this time that I do realize that ultimately policies are fueled between nation states, are fueled through individuals, through leaders. And leaders are not automatons, they have emotions, they have likes, they have dislikes, they have predispositions. But that at the end of the day, these personal elements in relationships between nations should be diminished as far as possible. And objective realities which propel cooperation should be given priority, and that friction points should be addressed and addressed in an equitable manner
Right.
so that neither side feels that its interests have been jeopardized.
Now, I want to understand from you the impact of India fairly proactively trying to keep sending messages to Bangladesh on the safety and security of the Hindus in Bangladesh. Two questions emerge out of this. One is that, of course, the larger issue that is India, it's the Indian government in some way trying to look at itself as the protector of Hindus all over the world. The other is that by making these statements and sending these messages to Dhaka, are we not opening ourselves to a likewise, you know, you know, demands being made by other nations on handling our minorities, the religious minorities in our country, and there is a continuing political conflict point on that issue in India.
Look, I will not go into the ideological issue since
Yes,
you've
cannot.
got me here as a former diplomat. I'll tell you
That's
that whenever one country sends a message relating to a section of the population of another country, its first concern is that there shouldn't be a mass movement from that country
okay.
uh, of that section of the population. And I think that's a valid concern.
Okay.
It's because if supposing there is a mass, the one country adopts a position that makes a section of the people there, let's take Hindus for example, feel terribly insecure, and they think that their security lies in crossing the borders and coming into India.
Coming to India.
Then that coming to India, then that will complicate situations. Yeah? It will have repercussions on our social fabric apart from straining resources. So, therefore, in
Okay.
terms of real politics and interaction between nation states, this is a perfectly valid thing to make. Now, the problem, of course, is that there is a certain ideological situation prevailing within the country, and
That's right.
people juxtapose that ideological position with the foreign policy stance or the foreign security stance that the government is taking.
Hmm.
Uh, I, for one, howsoever I may think, whatever I may think, and I do think I'm truly committed uh, to the idea that all Indian citizens are equal and should feel that they are equal and should feel that they are as much part of the full fabric of Indian life as any other citizen.
Right.
That is a deep commitment that I have. But when it comes to foreign policy, I'm aware that you've got to sometimes tell the other side that, look, please be a little careful on this, because I don't see. I mean, the matter may be raised by certain forces, uh, that this government's treatment of certain groups, certain minorities
That's right. It has
is
been raised in the last 10 years.
is contrary, yeah, and is contrary to certain norms, etc. But I don't think that geostrategically or geopolitically there is a concern in any of our neighbors that there will be movements of populations.
Right.
Whereas it is different when it comes to Hindus, say, in Bangladesh. So that is a life concern. And I think geopolitically and as a former diplomat, I can clearly see the distinction there.
Okay. So I think that the distinction is well made. Now, let's just hop over Bhutan. We'll come to Bhutan if we have time at the end of our conversation. Let's look at Nepal and India's ties with it. Very deeply entrenched, we have had a very long civilizational contact with Nepal, particularly with our defense forces. We've had new government in Nepal. Often said that KP Oli, the prime minister now, was possibly representing, was in charge, when the worst phase of India-Nepal ties were witnessed. How would you assess our situation with Nepal at the moment?
Obviously, China casts a large shadow on this relationship,
Okay.
and we can't wish China away. But again, the
True.
guiding principle has to be what I mentioned to you, that Nepal, as a sovereign country, has the right to make choices. But the choices that it makes, it should be aware, if they impinge on India's interests, then India would have to take action to protect those interests.
Okay.
Uh, Again, the factor of geography is very important. The factor of ethnic uh, affinities becomes important. And I'm not only talking of the Madhesis,
Hmm.
which, and that anyone in Kathmandu who looks at the map of Nepal and its connections with the neighboring territories
Right.
would be aware of these factors. Now, India must ensure that the lines of transport and movement of goods, etc., don't get interrupted.
Hmm.
That Nepal doesn't feel that India is trying to turn the screws on. But that should also make Nepal realize that if there is, and given the history of India China relations, that if there is Chinese activity in along the borders, then that will cause us concern. So if there is a realization in Kathmandu, forget the religious factors, forget the ethnic factors, etc. If there's a realization in Kathmandu that look, uh, we can develop ties with everyone, but that we've got to keep these factors in mind.
Hmm.
Then things would stabilize. But I have found that strangely, and this is not now, through the decades, despite changes in governments and systems in Nepal, there is almost a reflexive desire in many of them to take an anti Indian attitude. There is almost an assumption that India is out to interfere in their affairs.
I think, it's
I,
related to what you said right in the beginning. India's size is what
they,
actually makes them. That is what.
No,
It looks like that
I
it's looming over all the neighbors,
so
including Nepal.
you're absolutely right. And very often, while I was working, I used to tell my interlocutors from neighboring countries that, look, what do I do? What do we do?
We can do
If
nothing
we are
about it.
of this size, what do we do? We will not balkanize ourselves just to assuage your fears. You see us, you see what are the policies that we are pursuing. And if you think that by developing counter poises to us in through your relations with other countries, your interests are served better, then please go ahead. But do a cool analysis whether they actually have served you better. And once you do that, you'll come to the conclusion that baiting India is not helpful. Because geography, if nothing else, geography is against it.
Right.
And Nilanjan, in my experience, one can fight everything, but one can't really fight geography even in this age,
That's true.
the digital age when access by air and there are unmanned vehicles and I don't know, we are on the cusp of the most fundamental change perhaps in technology. But even then, it's my conviction that the factor of geography's importance can never be undervalued.
Yes, geography and also the traditional routes of exchanges of either
Yes,
goods or of human beings traveling or
that
of
is
job
right. I mean,
opportunities. Indian
these are
markets
these are
have greatly
yes,
drawn
these are
on
realities.
from
These
Nepal.
are realities. And therefore,
Yes.
there should be sensitivity on both sides and not these macho feelings. But unfortunately, when domestic politics begins intruding in these affairs, and then there is trouble. That is why I've said that we should leave our ideological predilections aside when we come to dealing in foreign policy and foreign strategies. But unfortunately, that is easier said than done.
Yes. To what extent do you think? I know I'm jumping the gun a bit, but since you mentioned this, I just cannot restrain from asking you this. To what extent do you think that this government has actually been able to, you know, to bring down its ideological, compulsions or whatever it wishes to do when it comes to foreign policy? There is a certain amount of an ideological rootedness of this government, especially right at the top. To what
Uh,
extent has this cast a dark shadow on India's foreign policy,
Look,
especially in the neighborhood?
I I think the greatest challenge that any government which is led by the Sangh Parivar faces is Pakistan.
That's right.
It's rooted in history, it's a reflexive thing. And if you see the record of the first NDA government led by Mr. Vajpayee, who did everything that is possible to get a modus vivendi with Pakistan, including
That's
going to the
right.
Minar Pakistan,
Hmm.
then you would find that he was able to overcome his ideological reflexes. Uh,
Yes.
and I think he spoke very eloquently on these issues. To give Prime Minister Modi credit, he started on the same basis. And if you see his record through 2014 and 15, I think he genuinely attempted, including showing enormous flexibility when it came to interpreting uh, joint statements, like the UFA joint statement of July 2015, if memory
Hmm.
serves me correct, which the Pakistani generals were very wild with Nawaz Sharif then. He showed this flexibility. Even after the Pathankot attack,
Right.
something which many people criticize him and very strongly, I think, including in the Sangh Parivar, he allowed a Pakistani delegation to visit Pathankot, and that included
Right.
an officer of the ISI.
Correct.
Even then, if you see his record, his national security team acknowledged that there was some cooperation in Gujarat. There were some intruders, and they let out that Pakistan had given some information. I think that if you see 2016, in Uri, he was forced to take action after the Burhan Wani killing and Pakistan going on a rampage. There is some evidence to show. I think perhaps the late Satilamba had written in his book that even in 2017 he was exploring some options. It is only when after 2019, after Pulwama,
Hmm. That they
that
actually
things
shut the door.
that things changed. And then after uh, the constitutional changes in J&K, uh, things really went south. And let me make 2 points to you. One,
Mhm.
I think the Pakistanis went on the wrong track altogether.
Okay.
If I was in Pakistan, I would have merely said that, look, whatsoever changes India wants to make in J&K, its status from the Pakistani viewpoint. I'm not
Okay.
accepting that. I'm saying it only from their viewpoint. They
No,
could
I
have taken the
understand.
view. They could have taken the view that it's an international dispute and these constitutional changes are internal to India and the dispute status does not change. But they didn't. They went on a complete. They went ballistic. Not only against the move, I mean, conjuring fears of demographic changes. Can they, even if the special status has been taken away and UTs were created and people from outside were permitted to buy property, etc., is it physically conceivable that in the foreseeable future there will be large movements of people from, say, the plains of India
No, I
into
don't think
the
so. It
Kashmir
is.
family? I mean,
In the
is that
last 5 years,
realistic?
it's been proven that that is going to be
No,
very
no, it is
difficult
not.
for a variety of reasons.
No, look, there has to be then a movement of population from outside, push out from Kashmir so that there's a vacuum and then people move in. That's not happening. That's never on the cards. So this was an absurd position that they took. And then to make it worse, they went vituperative against the Sangh. I mean, Imran Khan, with the support of the establishment, the kind of stuff he said against the Sangh was completely, in diplomatic terms, was way out. It was
Hmm.
never expected. So that is what brought relations to a standstill. And if you see, the actions which were taken by them. They downgraded relations. They asked high commissioners to leave. They stopped commercial relations. So all steps were taken by them. And then they put up this position that unless India reverses the steps it had taken in 2019, nothing can happen.
So,
Now,
so I just ask you a supplementary. Just a few weeks ago, our Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, he made a statement, saying that the era of uninterrupted dialogue is over, which is a very definitive statement. It has a certain amount of ring of finality to it. Uh,
look, there was never an era of uninterrupted dialogue.
that's right. You referred
Jaishankar
to
is a
Mr.
very
Gujral. He's the one who actually framed the composite dialogue process.
no, but the composite dialogue process was never uninterrupted. It went through various
Yes,
interruptions.
several
So,
jumps and
I for one didn't understand what Mr. Jaishankar meant, and I wish he'd clarified. Because as someone who's dealt with Pakistan professionally and someone who follows Pakistan, and I think one of my colleagues who's had a lot of experience with Pakistan, perhaps and has served as a High Commissioner, I think he tweeted, if my memory is correct, he tweeted, he said, when was there an era of uninterrupted dialogue?
Right.
So perhaps Mr. Jaishankar should choose his words a little more carefully. And I
Carefully.
think what he perhaps meant was that this was new wording uh, to indicate that terror and talks can't go together, that you can't expect that you can pursue, to the Pakistanis, he was conveying that you can pursue terror and hold us to ransom and also ask for talks. That era is over. Now, if he had said that, then that would have been accurate because we've
Okay.
said that many times. We resigned from that position many times, but after 2017, I
19.
don't think 19 especially, we have not.
Yes.
Before 2017, there was no formal dialogue going on. Yes, and if I'll just take your view back to 2015, I think it was on the 10th of December, if I'm not mistaken, when the late Sushma Swaraj went to Islamabad and on the margins of the Heart of Asia conference, she and her Pakistani counterpart decided to restart what was renamed then as the Comprehensive Bilateral Dialogue, and it was supposed to be full-fledged. And then Mr. Modi went on Christmas Day of 2015. And that is why I said Mr. Modi went out of his way. And I think the Pakistani generals never understood. They didn't simply understand that why was Mr. Modi neglecting them in reaching out to the Pakistani Prime Minister, especially a Prime Minister with whom the Pakistani generals had a long adversarial history. I personally think that he was acting as a civilian leader dealing with another civilian leader. I think at that stage, his advisors should have perhaps pointed out that visiting Nawaz Sharif was fine, was a noble gesture. Uh,
Hmm.
it was perfectly valid in terms of diplomatic exchanges at the highest level between two countries, but that the
Right.
realities of Pakistan demanded that India sounds the army and takes the army along in any initiative
Right.
with Pakistan.
So looking ahead, there's also this issue of SARC. We've seen the profile of SARC completely diminished in the last 10 years. Would it be right to say that it has been diminished primarily at the altar of Indo-Pak relations? So, what kind of a future is there for a joint regional cooperation, either on a platform or improving ties, on a even if it is on a need basis?
I think, and I've written about it fairly extensively, I think that India needs to be more active in its Western neighborhood.
Okay.
Because after all, the developments of August 21 in Afghanistan were also a blow. Uh, it's a different matter that now the Afghan Taliban, and the Pakistanis have are at loggerheads because of the
Hmm.
Tehreek-e-Taliban-e-Pakistan issue, uh, and that there are openings in Kabul, but there are inhibitions in Delhi to take up those openings fully. That doesn't mean diplomatic recognition of the Taliban. Please, that's
Hmm.
not what I'm
Yes.
indicating.
No, definitely
But a
not.
certain practical approach is there. But then the Taliban make it very difficult. I understand that because of their own theological positions and their manifestations of those theological positions. But sometimes, well, one has to deal with unsavory positions and unsavory ideologies and theologies. What do you do? National interests, you've got to do many things. Uh, so that uh, is a challenge. It is not an easy challenge to overcome. I think over the last 6 to 7 years, what Mr. Modi's tried is to create an eastern flank, BIMSTEC, etc., and also let this go southwards into the ocean, into the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka and Maldives, etc. So
Right.
that has posed its own challenge because of the Chinese shadow and the Chinese ingress into South Asia. And the Chinese are a factor. They're a factor worldwide today, and we've got to accept
Yes.
that. Uh, SARC, I'm not very hopeful because I don't think that on SARC there is much elbow room in Delhi. And that I think the Pakistanis need to do a fair amount of introspection. And I'll give you my
Okay.
reason. This is not to say that India should be very muscular, etc. Pakistan, of course, it has to defend its interests. And the fact that the ceasefire of February 21 is subsisting on both sides and it's lasting shows that there's a certain level of sanity in Pakistan, and that India also wants that ceasefire to continue. But I think what the Pakistanis really need to introspect is that this instrument of terror that they made part of their strategic doctrine in the 1990s,
That era is over.
no, that has been totally counterproductive.
Yes.
If you see the history of the last, say from 1990, say let's take 35 years. In the end of the 1980s, almost all HDIs were in Pakistan's favor vis-a-vis India.
Yes.
Today, 35 years later, when they have brought up, when they nurtured these groups and they thought that they'll have plausible deniability, what have they been able to achieve? Yes, they've tied down a large part of our armed forces in J&K,
In the Western sector.
in the western sector.
Yeah.
We've spent a lot of money there.
That's right.
But has that impeded our progress? We are the fifth largest economy in the world today.
It's true.
The Pakistanis are relying on the Chinese, CPEC, Western donors. What is their macro situation today?
We
They
have
are
our
living.
own, reasons, to disagree with the economic policies and the kind of growth that is happening in India. But that's a separate issue. That's an
No,
internal matter.
no. On that, I am committed to equitable growth.
Yes,
I think our constitution demands equitable growth.
exactly.
If you see the directive principles of state policy, and mind you,
Of
the
course.
Article 37,
But that cannot deny the fact that we are the fifth largest economy.
that can't deny the fact that yes, you are the fifth largest economy. And that in certain areas, like the use of technology to reach out for public programs, to reach out to the people and deliver goods, you've been successful.
Yes.
And so this can't be denied. The internal problems of our economy in terms of wealth distribution, etc., very much there and are very worrying, but that's another subject. What I am pointing out is that if I was sitting in Lahore or in Karachi or even in Pindi, and I was comparing the two countries' weight in international affairs today, what would I see? I would see that the world looks upon Pakistan as a basket case. They are on their 24th IMF program. The
That's right.
23rd ended and they've gone, and they think that is a mark of success for a government. Shouldn't that lead to some introspection that there is something wrong with the path we've adopted? But unfortunately, I think the Pakistani generals are showing no interest in changing course. And that is
I think
what
that's
there are. And let me add one last sentence. There are Pakistani scholars who, of course, the establishment hates, say a man like Hussain Haqqani, who is pleading with them for years that look, move from theological nationalism to territorial nationalism. The time has come when you move towards that, you'll be better off. But those are voices in the wilderness.
this territorial nationalism. That is something which has actually to become also more stronger in India, that viewpoint. Thank
Of
you,
course
Mr.
it
Karju.
should.
We
Of
have
course it should.
spoken for yes, please, you were saying something?
No, no, I said, of course, our nationalism should also be territorial.
Yes, of course. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Karju. You have actually taken us through this very complicated and a very delicate process of foreign policy with the neighbors in the framework of, we have a very ideologically rooted government in India, which is definitely markedly a majoritarian outlook. Very rarely do we actually get to talk about all these issues at kind of length that we have actually done. But a lot remains. We did not discuss Bhutan, we did not discuss, but just peripherally, Afghanistan, Maldives, you just kind of referred to towards the end. We completely ran out of time. But I promise you that I and the viewers also that we will get you back very soon, sometime later this year, to discuss the other issues pertaining to our neighborhood because many developments will take place. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal. Virtually, there isn't any country where there wouldn't be any developments. And then we are going to speak with you once again, Mr. Karju. And thank you for the moment now.
The Federal and Devaki Specialty Hospital jointly present the Madurai Marathon 2024 Run for Health on Sunday, October 20th, 2024. Entry is free for all.